This happened 3 summers ago. To preface this, I have been on a shocking amount of dates and put myself in many a foolish situation in the past. I'm a female and was 25 at the time it happened. It started off on the POF app. I came across a cute guy. He was my type, physically, kind of nerdy looking. On his profile, he had a very adventurous photo of him hiking and traveling. He seemed really exciting to get to know. Once he saw I looked at his profile, he sent me a message. We flirted a bit back and forth and exchanged numbers, even though he lived about an hour away. He said on the app he's never been to my city and didn't plan on it, so we probably wouldn't meet. I respected his honesty. I don't like wasting my time. One day shortly after meeting him online, he texted me randomly saying he's in my town on some work thing and invited me to a bar he was at. I decided to meet up since I was already in the area, and he said he would pick me up. I was dumb and agreed, even though it was just 4 blocks away. It took him way longer than it should have to get me, and I honestly don't think he was actually ever at the bar. Once in his car, I noticed it was a rental, and that it seemed like he had just gotten his license because he was a terrible driver. After driving in circles, he told me to pick a place, but not in the area because parking is impossible. I picked a place 15 minutes away by car with lots of parking, but also a busy place since I was not with a stranger. Once there, he started pressuring me to drink. He insisted. I'm not a huge drinker, but I enjoy pub-style bars, and I caved and had a drink and was again pressured to have another. He was very pushy and seemed really irritated that I wasn't going for it. Usually, I'd end a date pretty quickly if being mistreated, but he became charming enough to keep me there, at least until we were done with our date. I saw an old acquaintance at the bar and wanted my date to know I knew him. In my head, I think I wanted my date to know that someone could identify him. I'm not a paranoid person, but I think my subconscious was on alert. After an hour of talking in the car, I tell him I'm ready to head out. He insisted we go across the road to grab a coffee, and at the time it seemed strange to me. Neither of us had had much to drink and didn't need to sober up. Coffee seems like an odd choice otherwise. But I entertained it, and once there we sipped our drinks. He told me he had rented a beautiful Airbnb in a nearby neighborhood that is more out of the city/country, and he told me he had it all to himself and invited me, going on about how nice it is. I kept politely saying no and throwing around different excuses, which he would counter with a reason for me to come. With no intention of going, I agreed, but only if he would drive me home to get overnight things. I felt he wasn't going to let me say no, so he seemed happy with that answer and we headed out. While driving in the direction of my place, he said instead he would stop at a 7-Eleven and grab me travel-sized toiletries so I wouldn't need anything. I felt panicked because my plan was not to go with him. Something about him was off, and I felt stupid for even getting back in his car to begin with. He turned his car, and we were then heading towards a more country-like area. Literally, there aren't any 7-Elevens or anything in the middle of nowhere. Then I mentioned that I'm actually thinking I'd prefer not to stay with him, and asked to be brought home. He then said something that made me completely nervous to be around him for any longer. He said he's sharing the Airbnb with the owners, and that they are really fun and sweet, and that they drink and play games together. When originally, he said he had it all to himself. I knew that I didn't want to make it obvious that I was catching on to his lie, so I went along with it and said, "Oh, I have to wear my cute fluffy overnight PJs instead of my date dress, because I want to be more comfy." Then I spewed on a few other things. I mentioned that I need my medication and absolutely can't miss a dose. Surprisingly, he turned around and we drove back into the city, and I felt more calm but not safe. Finally, we got close to my place. I had no intention of him getting close enough to know where I lived. He was mentioning that he was going to come up to my apartment once we got there, and that's just one huge hell no. I didn't know what I would do, but I looked for an opportunity to get out of the situation, knowing he could turn around and take me somewhere private in a matter of 15 minutes. We got to a stop sign where people were crossing, thank God. I quickly but calmly got out and said, "You know what? I have a headache. I'll text you." I closed the car door, went through a public park, which was beside a building that his car wouldn't be able to drive into. I looked back to make sure he wasn't getting out of his car / following, and I could see him staring at me. He was so furious I have chills thinking about it. Within the hour, he had blocked me on the app. Looking back, I think he possibly wanted to get me a coffee to put something in my drink. I think he told me on the app that we weren't ever gonna meet to maybe cover his ass. And I know he didn't have good intentions. Since then, I have met my fiancée on the app and was super careful about dating up until then, making sure the first few dates are very public, and arranged my own transportation. Last year, we got some snow around this time of year. It was very pretty, but it's New York, so it's usually gorgeous here in the winter. I woke up one morning, did my morning routine, and went outside to check the mail, when I noticed footprints in the snow that did not belong to either me or my husband. They were far too large, extremely large. The person who made them would have to have been well over 6 feet tall, and I'm 5'11", and my husband is shorter than me. They started at the road and came up to our kitchen window. It looked like someone had just stopped to peek in. They continued around the side, then to the back of the house, where they looped around and went into the neighbor's yard. I followed them, and they went straight through my neighbor's backyard and into the field that spans off into the woods behind our house. And they just stopped, right in the middle of the field. They just vanished. We called the cops, and a police officer came by to look at them. He seemed a bit rattled and confused by it. He didn't really have an explanation as to why they had just stopped in the middle of the field. It had snowed a few days prior, and we hadn't gotten any more snow since, so it wasn't as if fresh snow had covered them. Otherwise, it would have covered the other tracks too. The officer asked around about our neighborhood, but the only other person nearby is an old woman in hospice care, so it couldn't have been her. The reason I'm sharing this is because I'm 100% certain that these tracks weren't made by a person. I don't know what they were, but I know that seeing them stop dead in the middle of a field like that made me feel sick to my stomach. I still think about it quite often when it snows, and I dread the day that I see them again. The other really peculiar thing about this to me is that I have dogs. In particular, I have 2 very vocal dogs who bark if they so much as hear a scratch in the wall or something outside. That night, they didn't make a sound. I should also say that our house is haunted. After doing some research into the property, I found that the last owner passed in the house due to complications of lung cancer. We have occasionally heard rasping, heavy breaths in the house, and I have personally seen apparitions, strange lights, and my husband has been physically hurt. We've had the house blessed last year, and things have calmed down quite a bit. I don't know if the footprints in the snow were related to this or not, but it remains an intensely disturbing experience for me. Let me start by saying I didn't believe in ghosts before this. All of this took place in 2014, in a small town in New Jersey. New Year's Eve going into 2014. and I was at my old friend Jay's house. He would always tell me about his house being haunted, and told me that the majority of the activity was confined to the attic. We decided to go up there and do a voice recording. I couldn't believe my ears when we put it on the speaker. We actually caught a voice, but much to my disappointment, my dumbass deleted it by accident. The rest of the recordings I do have though. So we told our other friend John about this, and he wanted to experience it for himself. Let me give you the layout of the attic. When you walk up the stairs, there's a little alcove to the left and a little alcove to the right. And when you get to the top of the stairs, there's a window on the back side of the attic. And when you turn around, there's a small room where the maid stayed back in the 1800s. Other than that, it was just a regular attic. Things scattered all over the place, holiday decorations, Jay and his siblings' old toys, and the like. So John, Jay, and myself went into the attic and put our phone voice memos on record. I put mine on in the main part of the attic, and John put his in the maid's room. We started asking the basic questions. What's your name? Did you live here? What year is it? After about 15 minutes, we decided to call it quits. I shut off my recorder, and John went to get his. And I heard chimes, and asked Jay if he had a clock in his attic, and he said no. I immediately wrote it off as my imagination. When John went to grab his recorder, he started goofing around. He walked into the maid's room and in a sarcastic voice said, "Hello," and then asked, "Is anyone here?" and grabbed his recorder and shut it off. When we put it on the speaker though, after John said hello, we heard a loud and clear shh, and then when he asked if anyone were there, we all heard a deep grumbling voice say, "Yes." Needless to say, we were all scared, but at the same time we were all terrified. However, we wanted more. It was like a drug. There wasn't much to do around in the area, and it was an adrenaline rush hearing that voice. The following week, I was with this girl I had a major crush on called Celia. She didn't believe in the supernatural at all. We showed her the recordings, and she insisted it was bull. She then started demanding to go into the attic. Jay didn't want to have any part of it, so he came up with us for a few minutes before we even turned on the recorders and said he wanted to go back downstairs and that he didn't feel safe up there. Celia also insisted on the lights being off when we did this. She said it would be more creepy. She didn't believe in it anyway, so we all thought it was a dumb request, but I had a crush on her, so her wish was my command. The lights went off, and she stood up next to me near the back window of the attic, and John stood in the maid's room. We started asking questions, and she had a sarcastic tone in her voice, much like John did at first as well. She then whispered to me, "Does Jay have a clock up here?" I was taken aback for a second. I told her I heard the same thing last week. Almost immediately after I answered, we heard John from the maid's room say, "Did you hear that?" As I was about to answer, thinking he was talking about the chimes, we all heard a child's whimper. Celia freaked out and started screaming to get her the hell out of there, and that she wanted to leave. John stopped his recorder, and I escorted Celia into Jay's room and came back into the attic to grab my own. As she sat and collected herself, John and I agreed with her permission to listen to the recordings at that moment, but there was no child's voice on the recording. She started getting agitated because she knew she heard the voice. She wanted to go back up, and we all agreed. John also told me we didn't say goodbye to the spirits either before we left, and that wasn't good. So we went back upstairs, did another recording and said goodbye. That time we didn't catch anything. And the next morning I woke up to 5 missed calls from Jay. I called him back immediately, and he answered, which wasn't like him. It was early in the morning, and Jay never woke up until 11. He told me I needed to go to his house as quickly as possible. You need to understand, Jay basically lived alone in the house. His brother usually had to fly out to California for work, and his father, who was retired, did a lot of fishing in Maryland. So at this point, Jay had been in the house by himself for about 5 days. Jay was always terrified of going into his attic for as long as I can remember. He told me that the spirit pushed him down the stairs when he was 10, and that the only way he went into the attic was with at least one other person. He was also a terrible liar. So when he told me this, I thought he was playing a trick on me, but I soon realized that it wasn't. He told me that around 3 a.m. after we left, he kept hearing noises in his attic, like things were moving around. He wanted to go check it out, but didn't want to go alone. He asked me to go first. As I walked up the stairs, I started laughing, because everything in the attic was in perfect order. Now, there was a rocking chair and a wooden chair facing out the right alcove window, and another chair facing the backside window. The right side alcove was completely closed off, and there was a desk and some wood blocking it. I turned to Jay and said, "Funny dude, I thought you didn't like it up here." But when I looked in his eyes, I can tell it wasn't him that moved them. He was stricken with horror and frozen still. He tried to get the words out of his mouth. I asked him if it were okay if I did another recording. I put my phone down and began. I started to ask if it could throw things around or move something or hit me. Nothing. I opted to provoke it. I walked over to the rocking chair and had this feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach. I turned to Jay and said, "I don't like this dude." He chuckled, but we both listened to the voice recording back, and there was an old man's voice saying, "Get up." We didn't hear it at the same time, so we kept provoking and moving things in that little spot, and that's when on the recorder we heard a little girl say, "Why are they doing that?" When Jay and I heard that, we were scared. This wasn't like the first voice. This wasn't like the child we heard in the attic at this point. We realized something. We didn't know what, but we both had that same feeling. We both needed answers. I called John and told him to go to Jay's at around 8. I had class and was in barber college at the time, and I would meet him there. Then I headed to Jay's after class and met John and Jay there. We went up to the attic and started recording. We asked the regular questions again. We went back to listen and we heard the chimes that Celia and I had heard. I was pretty astounded to hear that, but we didn't catch any voices, so relaxed that next day. And I sent the recording to my friend Frank. He showed it to my friend Pat, who then called me, telling me to never go into the attic again. He told me that those chimes were the notes of the devil's triad. I tried to look it up but couldn't find anything, but I trusted Pat. He told me those chimes were to show that you worshipped the devil. This piqued my interest, and after I got a call from Pat, I told Jay that I had something to tell him, and asked to go over to his house, and he told me he had something to show me. I got to his place, and he was on the porch smoking a cig. I pulled out one and had it with him, and noticed he was holding a book. He told me he found it, and handed it to me. It was a Bible. He told me that he was renovating his basement space and it was behind a wall. Inside it read, "Presented to Roseanne Edwards by her cabinet, April 9th, 1862. He told me to turn to one of the pages. I forgot which page, but on that page was a dark handprint. He said it looked like dried blood. There's no way to verify that. I still don't know to this day. I told him what Pat told me, and he was taken aback. I told him we should go to the country clerk and find out more about the house. Before I left, I asked Jay to put the Bible in the attic to see if we could stir up any activity. I called Celia and went straight to the country clerk together. She asked to come to Jay's later that night, as she hadn't been back because she was afraid. We went through the documents at the clerk's, and we found something interesting. We saw previous owners up until 1910s, but after that we saw that it was owned by a company starting in the 1850s. The house was where they allowed workers to live, but there were no documents about who lived in the house, so all in all, nothing significant. We went back to Jay's that night and met John there. Jay said the house felt heavy all day. We all knew what that meant. The energy shifted the moment we walked into the house. We all felt scared, and none of us wanted to even approach the attic. Although we heard movement up there from downstairs, we didn't want to go up. I do regret that. I'm sure we would have captured something good, but we were all afraid. We left the Bible in the attic on Jay's request, and we all discussed getting a priest there to get the house blessed, but Jay didn't want to. I told my younger brother about it, and he didn't believe me. I went to Jay's house, where we all heard the noise, and then he refused to go into the attic after hearing it. Just as we were leaving, we stepped outside, and my brother and I heard a baby crying. It was at least midnight in the middle of winter, and my brother and I looked at each other confused. "Why is there a baby crying?" my brother said. It was getting louder, but then Jay interjected. "What baby?" We kept hearing it escalate in loudness. It got so loud I felt like I should cover my ear. "Don't you hear that?" I said. Jay didn't have a clue what we were talking about. That's when it just stopped. Jay had a weird look on his face, and his eyes got wide and he said, "Bro, look at your car." There was a small child's handprint all over the car. I was afraid to get in, and for the entire ride home my anxiety was peaking. I thought that if I would look in the rearview mirror, I'd see something, but nothing happened. When I finally got home, I was messaging Celia about what happened, and she told me that a cat had hissed at her. That cat had never done anything like that before, and when she walked into her house, the cat just hissed. As I was trying to calm her down, the bookshelf I have in my room came tumbling down, and a small metal box I owned went across my room and hit the wall and broke in half. Jay told me it felt like his house went through a small earthquake, and after our separate experiences, Jay agreed to have the Bible taken out. Activity significantly calmed down, and that was it. When I tell people this story, I always wish that I had a better ending. But something tells me that this isn't over. 3 years ago I moved to Florida, found a job in a shop, and people in the shop were telling ghost stories. I never brought mine up. When I tell people the story, I feel like they'll think I'm crazy, even though everything you've just heard actually happened. I don't think people believe it, so I don't tell them until I know them relatively well. Anyway, they were telling stories, and one person pointed to me and said, "This guy had a story." And I thought he was pointing to someone else, so I looked behind me, and he laughed and said, "No, you. That shadow let me know. You've got something attached to you." He then proceeded to tell me the story of Jay's house. I felt like I wanted to cry when he told me. Ever since then, I've started doing investigations on my own. This story starts around 7 years ago, when I was a senior in high school. I joined the cross-country team my senior year and really loved the experience and the team camaraderie. The boys and girls team trained together in the A groups and B groups. The A group was all boys and me. I didn't mind this. It definitely pushed me to be a better runner, but it was difficult to try and keep up with them. Being an A group, I grew a lot closer to the guys, and they knew I had a boyfriend. One guy, Joe, was really funny, and we got along great. We'd sit next to each other on the bus to meet, and we'd text a lot, but I thought we were just friends. After cross-country ended, the boys convinced me to do indoor track, and this is where Joe got weird. In January, my relationship ended, and it was whatever. A high school relationship ending isn't the end of the world, but Joe started to act strangely towards me. He'd get really mad if I didn't text him back. I went to a house party and drank, and he sent me this long text about how he was disappointed in me, and he thought I was better than that. Our friendship started to get emotionally abusive. Joe kept on mentioning how I made him feel worthless, and he said things like, "I bet you wouldn't even care if I died." He got jealous all the time and became so controlling. I was already under school stress, so I decided to take a break from Joe. He didn't like this. Joe started spreading rumors around school that I was hooking up with guys that had girlfriends, and that I did sexually explicit things for weed. Just really awful things. Fortunately, most people didn't believe him. By the time outdoor track came around, our friendship was completely over. I was really happy because the girls and boys track teams were two separate things, and girls' distance had their own coach and their own practices. So I saw Joe but never had to train and or practice with him. He stopped calling and texting me, and that was a relief too. After track season ended and I was about to graduate, Joe sent me a long apology. He said he didn't know he had feelings for me until my boyfriend and I broke up. He said that's what triggered his weird behavior, and he was sorry for ruining our friendship. I accepted his apology and went on with my life. We texted from time to time, but we absolutely were not close friends anymore. The summer after my senior year is where Joe started to make me nervous. At least once a week, at 1 or 2 in the morning, a car would drive down our street blasting its horn. It became such an issue that the whole neighborhood was on watch for the mystery horn blaster. I started getting texts from Joe some nights, saying things like, "Come out." I'd reply the next morning with a question mark, and he'd say he was drunk and just drunk texted. I worked over the summer, so I was usually in bed by 9 or 10. But one night I was up a little late. When I turned on my light in my room, I immediately got a text from Joe that said, "Good night, Monty." It freaked me out. I told my parents everything that had happened, and they were concerned. My dad immediately thought Joe was the mystery honker. I sent Joe a non-threatening text just saying that I worked long days, so I'm normally in bed early, so I'd appreciate not getting texted so late. I still got sporadic texts from Joe, but the mystery honking stopped, which was great. In the fall, I went away to college. One weekend I came back home. I was up in my room and got a message from Joe around midnight saying, "Welcome home, Monty." I freaked out and looked outside but didn't see his car. I asked how he knew I was home, and he said lots of people were home for the weekend, so he just assumed I was too. Joe then proceeded to favorite all of my tweets, around 2,000, and like all of my Instagram posts. I had literally had enough of him at this point and blocked him everywhere. I texted all my friends and told them what happened and to not mention me to Joe at all because he was definitely obsessed with me. Joe then called me and told me he was going to end himself. I told my parents everything, and my dad got the police involved, and I didn't hear from Joe after this, until 2 summers later. It's important to note around this time, one of my brothers moved out. My mum wanted to turn my room into an office, so I moved upstairs into his old bedroom. My room now faced the back part of the house and not the street. My dad works in the courts, and occasionally he has to do bail duty, where if someone gets arrested, he's the person that has to post bail. It sucks because he can get a call at 2 a.m. and has to go to bail someone out. On one particular night, my dad got a bail call at 2. He went downstairs, got some water, and saw the motion light in the backyard was on. That was weird. He looked out the kitchen window and saw a guy in our backyard looking up at my room. He ran outside and the guy jumped the fence. The police came and took statements, but it was the middle of the night and my dad was pretty tired, so it could have been Joe, but the police couldn't really prove it. The next few months I felt on edge. I felt really unsafe in my own home. How did Joe know I moved rooms? How long had he been watching me? It was nauseating. My parents saw the toll this was taking on me physically and emotionally. I was snapping at them over small things. My hair was falling out and I was losing weight. One day at breakfast, my dad walked into the kitchen and said, "I'm handling the Joe situation today. He won't bother you anymore." After that, the incident stopped. I ran into Joe at a party a few years later. He saw me, turned white, and left the party. I have absolutely no clue what my dad did, but he made sure Joe and I will never meet again. This happened to me 3 years ago. I was in college but took night class because I was working full-time by day. That night, my class ended at around 10 p.m. The school is a bit far away from my home. I could walk, but it was winter, and lots of snow had fallen that week. The walkways were full of snow. It would have taken me forever to walk home. My bus app told me I had just missed the bus, and the next one was a half-hour away. When this happened, I would always walk to the nearest subway because there was another bus stop, and instead of waiting and freezing, I would walk to warm myself up a little. So that's exactly what I did that night. The shortest way to the subway station was through a park. I always took that path and had no reason to worry that this night was going to be any different. Before arriving to the park entrance, I noticed there was a guy with a very recognizable hockey-themed winter hat, smoking near benches. As soon as he saw me, he picked up his things and slowly walked towards the walkway. I have no idea why, but I found him suspicious, and I remembered something my mum told me when I was a kid. When you feel like something is off about someone at night, find any reason you can to slow down and let them walk past you. You'd rather have someone in front of you than behind. For some reason I thought he was weird and did as my mum told me. I faked receiving a text and slowed down so that he would be in front of me. He was so incredibly slow, as if he wanted me to get past him, but I would just slow down even more. He was vaping something that smelled like super fake strawberry, and I was hoping he wouldn't go into the park, but he did. We walked like that in the park until I noticed there was a hockey game going on, and I decided I would go and watch the match, just to let him take some distance before I carried on going. As I was turning right to get to the outdoor ice rink, he turns left on a path that goes by a building. I was reassured that he wasn't going in the same direction that I needed to go. Still, I was a bit curious about the match, so I watched for a minute or so, then turned back to go on my path, and as I turned, my blood ran cold. The same guy that turned left was turning the other corner of the building. He had just walked around it. If I had kept going instead of watching the hockey by doing this, he would have been behind me. I was petrified, but I was still relatively safe because there were people around. The guy walked slowly as ever in the direction I needed to go, but I did not follow him straight away. I waited for a bunch of students to walk by and walked behind them. He was waiting by the park exit checking his phone, and when I saw the bunch of students, he walked away at normal speed. I saw him turn right on a street and thought it was the end of it. Eventually I reached the subway station and started waiting for the bus, and then I smelt it. A very familiar potent strawberry smell. And as I turned to look around, there was the guy with the hockey-themed hat and another guy, both staring at me. When the bus arrived, I was shaking, and it was not because of the cold. They both got on the bus with me and other passengers, and I told the bus driver about what happened, where I live, and past 9 p.m, women can ask the bus driver to be dropped alone at a bus stop, making sure no one can follow her. And that's exactly what the bus driver did. I had the bright idea to get out one stop early, and I walked in the opposite direction from my way home and waited for the bus to leave. As I turned around to wave at the bus driver as a way of thanking him, I saw the two guys banging in the middle door. The bus driver had locked them so they wouldn't open. I took that bus almost every night, and I never saw those two guys again, nor have I ever seen them near my house. But they were banging on the doors, and although I couldn't hear them, I could clearly see them yell at the bus driver. When the lights finally turned green and the bus left, I rushed back home, faster than I ever did in the snow. The next night after school, I was too nervous to use my shortcut through the park, so I took the long way around and got my bus safely. But what I saw on that ride scared the living hell out of me. At the bus stop that I had dropped off the previous day were the two guys, one with a hockey-themed hat. They did not get on the bus. My first thought was that they were waiting for me and not the bus. But luckily for me, this was not my stop. Perhaps I was paranoid and this is just a strange series of coincidences, but I was scared to get on that bus, and still am today. I moved in with my boyfriend since then, but the shortest way to our house is through the park. I still take the long way round though, when I'm traveling at night. Every summer, I go upstate to a little retreat called my grandparents' house. It's a nice pad, a big place with lots of rooms, in the middle of nowhere, and it's pretty quiet for the most part. It's pretty much in the middle of the woods, and our nearest neighbor is quite a way down the road. There's plenty of space in that house, with 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 3 floors, and an attic. My grandparents never ever use it, and I basically got the basement all to myself. It was a sweet setup. There was a bathroom, a fridge, a television where I play my games console, and a comfortable couch to lounge around all day on. It's the perfect retreat to relax and unwind in peace, when I wasn't running around exploring the woods, of course. It was a typical Friday afternoon for me. I'd just gotten done work around 5 p.m, the most tiring part of the day where the sun is shining, and I'm tired most. I'm ready to unwind and settle down for the rest of the night, when my grandparents inform me that they're going out to catch a show with friends and have dinner, so they'll be back later. I was stoked to hear this, as I love having the house to myself, especially after a long day working. After ensuring everything is off and all the doors are locked, I see them off and order a pizza. After it arrives, I retreat to my little man cave in the basement and lock the door so if I fall asleep, my grandparents won't wake me up if they decide to check on me when they arrive home. Everything was going pretty great. A few hours pass at this point, and the sun is completely down, concluding a very lazy Friday afternoon. It's roughly 10 p.m, and I'm in the middle of watching my show when I hear the floorboards creaking upstairs, the signal that my grandparents have returned home. It sounded like there were 4 sets of feet instead of 2, so It was a safe bet that they brought their friends over for company, which was pretty common. I hear chairs creaking and sounds of conversation, so I turn up my TV and lounge back. Before I knew it, I'm drifting off to sleep, and just as I thought it would happen, I hear the doorknob above jiggle. I just ignore it and relax. After about 2 hours of peacefully laying there, I decided to call it a night and head upstairs to my real bed. It's midnight now, and all quiet up above, so I assume everyone has gone to bed already. I get up from the couch and head upstairs to the first floor. I unlock the door, and a few of my kitchen lights are on, as well as the TV, but for some odd reason it was muted. I figure my grandma was possibly in the bathroom and was wrapping up her show or something. So I left everything on and walked over to the stairs to the second floor. This is when I realized something wasn't right. From the downstairs you can see the doors to every room. At night, when my grandparents are asleep, they usually keep their doors closed, or obviously the bathroom door closed if someone is using it. When I looked up, however, the upstairs was pitch black, and all I could see is every single door open. I called out upstairs, but I didn't get any response at all. In fact, it seemed as if this house somehow grew more silent. I walked over to the front window and looked out. Not a single car was in the driveway. I was the only one home. I called my grandparents to check in. They were still out, and they let me know it would be a late night. I asked them if they had stopped at any point back home, and they hadn't. Nobody had come home since 5. We weren't expecting any visitors either. The entire time, it was just me, in the house, alone. But I knew that I'd heard something upstairs, so I called upstairs to them. I checked around the living room as quietly as I could, knife in hand, and I refrained from calling out the police like a total idiot. My grandparents even offered to when I told them about the situation, but I opted not to. I silently checked the doors. They were all still locked, and I checked the windows. They were locked too. I sat in the living room and listened hard. It was just silence. After about an hour, the front door opened and my grandparents were finally home. Their presence calmed me down a lot. We searched the rest of the house and there didn't seem to be any sign of a break-in. There weren't any other incidents after that, and my grandparents had actually moved since then. I wasn't really able to sleep well in the house after that night. It always felt like I was being watched. Always. To this day, I'm not really sure what it was. The reason I'm sharing this with you now is because one thought dawned on me. We never did search the attic that night, nor did my grandparents ever go up there. There was so much space in the house, there was never any reason for us to. But maybe, just maybe, somebody else did. A comforting thought to have was when the entrance to the attic was in fact in my bedroom. Back around 2004, I worked as a maintenance man at a small music college on Long Island, New York. It was an easy job, changing light bulbs, painting, minor electrical work. One of the jobs was coming in early on days that it snowed, plow the parking lots, and shovel off the sidewalks, so the students could go about their day. This one morning, I got in at around 2 a.m. to start shoveling off the walks in the parking lot. Now for a little backstory. Back in the 18th century, the area that the school was on was a large family farm. Like many farms back then, when you died you were buried on the property, in a little private graveyard. So the graveyard for the old farm is still on site, and was grown over by trees, and you couldn't really see it from the school building. All the security guards who worked overnight used to talk about seeing a ghost walking around the school hallways at night. Some even saw a ghost dog running up and down the halls. I rarely believed them, and just thought they were messing with us. Back to the snow day. The way my partner and me would clear the walkways, he would use the snowblower outside, and I would walk through the empty building and clean off all the exit doors, and we would continue until we got down to the last door at the very end of the school. As I headed to the last doorway, I noticed that the inside doormat is wet, and it looks like someone had stamped on it, which I find odd, because the door is locked, and all the security guards are way back on the other side of the building. I look through the glass door and notice footprints on the fresh snow right outside the glass door, but don't see any wet footprints going down the hall, except for the wet snow on the doormat. Now I begin to freak out a bit. Just as I see this, my partner with the snowblower comes around the corner. I show him the prints, and we decide to follow them. The footprints go along this side of the building and head off towards the tree line where the graveyard is. As we go along following the prints, I notice there are no other prints in the snow except the ones we're following. Now we get to the edge of the forest and notice the prints heading right to the old graveyard. We go inside the woods and go right up to this little broken down fence that was put up to keep people out of the graveyard. As we look inside the fence, I see the prints originate from the foot of one of the graves. It looks like the person just rose up from the ground and went out for a stroll. Freaked me and my partner out for a while after that. Around 2 years ago, my mum told me to go to the attic to put away some decorations from Halloween. I made a few rounds when I noticed the cat at the corner of my eye. It had no body or head, just white ears, legs and a tail. When I told my mum about it, she went into the attic to try and find the cat, but found nothing. The other time I believe I encountered it was when I was walking to my parents' room. I started hearing a cat screaming at the door of the attic. It sounded like a young kitten, but none of the cats screamed like what I heard. I opened the door, and the screaming stopped. When I told my mum about the screaming, she went up to find my oldest cat under the guest bed and nowhere near the door. I'm not sure if it's the spirit of my neighbor's cat that died a few years ago, because of how the patterning was, as it looked familiar, or if it's something else entirely. This all happened when I was 19. I'm not the best looking dude, so I've never had much luck with women, and I ended up on Tinder. I wasn't having much luck there either until the 3rd month of using it, when a blonde woman named Katie messaged me. She was pretty enough that I dismissed her as a bot. It wasn't until 3 days later that she messaged me again, which was odd because most bots never message more than once. I clicked her chat and replied, then looked at her profile. What I saw was pretty generic, but definitely not a bot's profile. We'd been speaking for about a month when she proposed the idea that I come and see her. I was pretty reluctant as she lived nearly 8 hours away by car, but I had to admit, I really did like her quite a bit, and I had been thinking about asking her if I could come see her for a while now. After a bit more badgering from her, I finally said I would take the drive. At this point, I had no reason to doubt who she said she was. We had video chatted every other week and called most days. I assumed I got really lucky. Things did get a little weird on their way though. She kept messaging me asking me where I was to make sure I was still coming. At some point, when I took more than 30 minutes to respond, she sent me a slew of annoying texts. Admittedly, I had chalked this up to her being nervous about me coming to see her. I was pretty nervous about it too, and couldn't blame her. I had a hard time finding her house at first. The directions she gave me were pretty confusing, and it was back through a series of gravel and dirt roads and a large thicket of trees. It was still about midday when I came onto an old-looking house. A window on the second floor was boarded up, and it didn't look abandoned, just worse for wear. Katie's red buggy that she liked to talk about was parked in front of the garage. I looked at my phone and texted her that I was here. She only sent a smiley face in return. When I got out of my car to go knock at the door, I noticed someone was looking at me from the second floor windows. It was creepy, but I figured it was her father or someone. She had told me he comes to stay with her every now and then, so I ignored it and knocked on her door. She answered with a smile and even gave me a kiss, which surprised me, and I followed her inside. We sat down on her couch and started talking about our plans when I asked her about her dad. "You didn't tell me your dad was here," I said. "Was that going to be a surprise or—" Katie looked confused and told me that her dad wasn't here. I still thought she was keeping up the act, and I told her that she didn't have to keep pretending, and that I had seen him looking at me through the upstairs window. Katie went pale and said we had to get out of there now. We both ran to our cars, and when I questioned Katie, she informed me that her dad wasn't there and that she had been home until I showed up. I called the police, and while I was on the phone giving the address, Katie gasped and pointed to the window where I had seen the guy last. He was looking at us from the window again. I get a better look at him, and he seemed older and frail, almost like he hadn't eaten anything in a while. He left the window after he noticed we had spotted him. The police took a half hour to show up, and the whole time Katie was crying and mumbling about how she was an idiot for not keeping her doors locked. When the police finally did show up, one started asking me and Katie questions, and the other two searched the house. They came back out a little later and told me and Katie that while they didn't find anyone, they did find that the back door was hanging open. Whoever it was had run out into the woods, but the cops were sure the house was empty. After the cops left, Katie asked me to stay the night because she was too scared to be in her house alone. I gladly did and slept downstairs on the couch, as Katie's bed was the room next to the one the man had been in. Katie had also bought out the shotgun her father had given her but never used. I told her it was fine, the man was gone, but she insisted she'd feel safer if we had it out. I'm glad she did. Later that night, I was still wide awake watching TV. Katie had somehow managed to fall asleep, and from the kitchen, I heard the sound of the doorknob being turned. At this point, I wasn't even scared, I was just pissed. I flipped on the light in the kitchen and pointed the gun at the kitchen door, and there he was. The guy that had been in the house before was standing on the other side of the glass door. He looked shocked, and I'm glad we had locked the door. The man unfroze and yet again ran into the woods. I woke up Katie and told her what happened and called the police yet again. When they arrived, they did a sweep of the woods and found no one, and they told Katie and me that it would probably be a good idea to stay somewhere else for the night. Me and Katie said our goodbyes. She was going to go stay at her friend's house and I was going home. I left a little after she did, and I was on the phone with my brother telling him about what happened. My headlights were on, and as I was talking, something caught my eye. The man was standing at the corner of the house just watching me. I gunned it out of there and didn't even bother calling the cops again, but I did text Katie, and she was going to call them. I don't think Katie even went back to the house alone after that. Our oldest son, Caden, was 3 at the time, and our youngest son, Connor, was 5 months. It still gives me chills and makes me uncomfortable each time I walk by this window. For the story, it was January evening. It was dark outside with a few inches of snow on the ground. We had just finished eating dinner, and I was planning on giving our little one a bath. My husband drives trucks for work, so isn't home very often. It's me and the boys during the week. Caden was playing in his toy room that has a door leading to the side deck. A little detail. We have no sensor light or even a porch light on the whole side of the house. At this time we didn't use the deck at all, only for our grill during the summer months. It's not close to the sidewalk or the next street over, basically an open space yard off the deck. Anyway, Caden was playing in the toy room waiting for his turn to take a bath while I brought Connor into the bathroom. We were just about done with bath time when I heard Caden's little feet running towards the bathroom. He stands in the doorway and says, "Mummy, there's a man looking in the side door." I think it's a mailman, but then my heart skipped a beat as I realized 1, no mailman would be coming at 7 p.m, 2, it's the side door he called at, and I didn't even hear a knock. I began to sketch myself out more by thinking about how there's no light on the deck, and this person would have to walk through the yard, in the snow, walk up the back stairs of the deck, and go to that door when the front porch light was on and attached to a shoveled sidewalk. I took Connor out of the bath, put him in a towel in his little chair, and told Caden to sit with his brother and not come out until I said it was okay. He was confused but listened and just kept asking what was wrong. I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, had 911 ready to call, and put on my mama bear face. When I walked to the side door, I shined the flashlight on my phone through the window of the door at a distance, walking up to it to hopefully scare someone away. The worst thought was that I would reach the handle and realize it was unlocked. Someone could have walked right in. I flung the door open and shined my light, held up my knife and yelled, "Hey!" in the most threatening voice a 5'4", 120-pound woman could make. There were footprints in the snow up to the deck stairs and back down going into the field and woods behind our house. I slammed the door, thoroughly freaked out, and locked it. I called the police and waited in the bathroom with the boys. While I was in there, I asked Caden, "Do we know who the man was?" "No," he said, "but he smiled and waved at me for a long time." I asked him what he was wearing, and he told me a hat that looked like a mailman's, and he wasn't wearing a coat. The police officer came and searched the property with flashlights. He asked me and Caden questions, and then informed me he not only saw the footprints leading up to the side deck, but to the outside door to our basement and the kitchen window on the other side of the house as well. He suggested I have someone come and stay with us for the night, and they will continue to follow the footprints that were left in the snow back to the field and the woodline. My father-in-law slept on the couch that night, firearm ready. My mother was a nervous wreck, and I got very little sleep that night. I never heard back from the police. I'm guessing tracks were lost through that bit of woods. Caden still mentions it from time to time randomly, and we got a blackout curtain for that door. I'd still very much like to get better locks to be safe. My husband and my father think it might have been a man who saw me home alone while passing and wanted to hopefully sneak a peep. But why just stand and watch my child and go around the whole back of the house and not by the front door or street? I hope to never see that creep's face and hope he never smiles or waves at my child again. I work in a haunted salon, and I've had so many experiences here. The salon is an 114-year-old shotgun house with super high ceilings and pocket doors. It's located in an industrial area in the south. I think the house was relocated because it's super out of place. They bought the house back in the 90s for $20,000 with the intention of bulldozing it and expanding their family company next door. However, the city wouldn't let them because it's the oldest house in the town. It's been vacant the whole time they owned it, except for a brief period when her cousin lived in it. It didn't have any power or plumbing, so the cousin ran a hose and extension cord from next door. They had to gut the entire place during renovation. The inside was rotting and falling apart. It's beautiful now. They preserved the pocket doors and kept the same layout. The natural light is amazing. I love working here. It's just me and Dee that work in the house. She does facial and lashes and I do hair. So, on with the good stuff. When I first started, Dee told me the batteries from the thermostat kept going missing. We have cameras all over the salon and outside. She would watch the cameras and nothing would show up. One day pretty recently, we had someone working in the attic. She came down and said, "You know there's a bunch of batteries up here, right?" Another time, and this is my favorite story, Dee and I were working on a Saturday. She poured a glass of wine for her client and replaced the cork. I remember watching her do this because she flipped the bottle upside down to make sure it was secure, and I thought it was funny. She put the wine back in the fridge and did the service. After she was finished, she left for the day. I left to run an errand, and when I got back from the salon, I came to find wine all over the floor. I look in the fridge, and the wine doesn't have a cork in it. The cork is on the top of the fridge. I texted her something along the lines of, "You forgot to put the cork back in, you dumb hoe." And she responded, "You watched me cork the wine and laughed at me." I told her to watch the cameras, so she did. The cameras showed me walking out the door, and then they go offline. A few days later, Dee was alone doing facials. She shuts the door when she does facials and massages, and mid-facial she heard someone walking up and down the hallway. She thought it was me because I wear boots to work, and it sounded like someone in boots. Then it sounded like someone slammed against her door, so she walked out and there was no one there. She watched the cameras, and there's nothing, no one in the hall. I hear knocking, walking, and even faint talking sometimes. I don't feel super scared. I get a little freaked out when I'm in here at night by myself, but for the most part I don't feel threatened. When I first started, I posted a bunch of pictures on the space on my Instagram. One of my friends stopped me one day and said, "I don't know if you're aware, but there's a presence in each photo you posted." I didn't think much of what she said because I didn't see the presence she was pointing out. It's weird when other people bring it up with no context. Dee had a client in her mid-60s pull her aside after her service and said, "Baby, you got spirits in here. They're not evil, but you might want to open up a Bible and let them find their way." Last night, Dee closed up the salon. We're all super vigilant about turning lights off because this house would burst into flames if there was a spark. She turned everything off and the doors lock automatically, but we always check because it's in a kind of sketchy part of town. She comes in this morning and every single light is on and the front door is wide open. Nothing was moved. We both have cash laying around and none of it was missing. It was weird. I lived in a van and traveled to the country working seasonal jobs. When I would get somewhere new, I used Tinder to meet and make friends. Anyway, I was in Auburn and I had a few drinks at a bar hoping to meet locals. When I left the bar, it was dark. I was walking to my van when I heard someone say my first and then last name. Massive red flag. I live 6 states over. Nobody but the guy who checked the ID at the bar could know my last name. I turn around and saw this guy sitting on some bricks smoking a cigarette. "Yeah, that's me," I say without thinking. "Hey, my name's Chris. We matched on Tinder." I stood with him and we spoke, and he said he lived right there, pointing to the door behind the bar that leads to the studios on the second story. We hung out, had a drink or two, and he invited me up for dinner, cooked it at the community kitchen, and I wasn't planning on going to his place, but I was talking about Magic the Gathering, and he said he had some cards and was wondering if I wanted to check them out. I agreed. His studio was literally the size of a closet. It had a bed, a fridge, and there was a little nook in the corner that had a shower and a toilet. It was less than 100 square feet. I looked through his cards and told him nothing I was interested in. He said it figures, because they were given to him and he doesn't play. The next day, I go to the local game store to play Magic the Gathering, and guess who walks in? He offers to get drinks and I decline. I tell him I'll add him on Facebook and message him if I change my mind. He gives me his name and looks over my shoulder while I type it in the app. He pops up and I tap on his profile, then I see it. 500 mutual friends. I don't live anywhere near him. I've been here 3 days. Then I think, oh, I am friends with a lot of drag performers on Facebook. Maybe he is too. I add him and leave. Once in my van, I get on Tinder for the first time since arriving, and I swipe and I swipe, and I pay the $4.99 to get more swipes, and I swipe and I swipe, and I don't see him. Where is he, this Chris guy? 2 hours later, I find him. I open his profile. 500 mutual friends. I swipe right. Nothing happens. It doesn't say you've got a match. Not only have we never matched, but he didn't even swipe on me. Was he trying to hide the profile? I felt like I kept seeing him that week. I didn't want it to cause me to change travel plans and leave early, but it started to freak me out. He would show up at the bar that I was at, or the game store when I was there, even though he told me he didn't play Magic. I started to get really uneasy, so I checked his Facebook profile again. All of the mutual friends were my close friends, my childhood friends, my family, my teachers, my co-workers. I couldn't handle it anymore, and changed my entire winter plans just to get out of there. Unrelated. 3 weeks later, I read in the news that his apartment and the bar we had met in had burned down. This story happened to me about 6 years ago, but I think about it frequently because it's the only paranormal thing I witnessed that I'm 100% sure was real. I can't help but thinking, maybe someone else has had a similar experience. It was in the middle of winter and terribly cold. There was a huge storm outside. I went to my kitchen to make myself some tea. It was about 11 p.m. Note that I'm used to going to bed at roughly 3 to 4 a.m., so I wasn't tired at all. I was approaching the table when my gaze accidentally fell on the street outside. I saw 2 men in dark clothes walking there along the road. They struck me as unnatural right away because of how they were walking. Calmly, slow, leisurely, talking and gesturing to each other. With how strong the wind was, people just couldn't walk like that. I adjusted the curtain to take a better look. It hid the men from my view for less than a second, and when I looked again, they were gone. The road where they were walking is very long and surrounded by nothing. There was nowhere for them to hide during this split second. I was shocked and curious. The next night I checked again but saw no one. The night after that, I saw them again. The men were walking in a similar snowstorm, just as slowly. I stared at them for a while, then moved the curtain out of curiosity, and a second later they were gone. I've never seen them again after this though. and I still check the street every now and then whenever I approach the window. My impression is that I somehow took a peek into some other reality where it wasn't cold, or saw ordinary two men going on their way. But who knows what it really was. I did see some other strange things during my life, but I can be fully sure of it. I'm not impressionable, and I try and find a rational explanation for everything. And this is the only case where I can't. Maybe some of you have some insight as to what this could have been. Everything begins when I was in my early years of high school. My sister, quite a few years older than me, moved out of our family home and into her first apartment. My mum was seeing someone new for the first time in a decade after her divorce with my father. My soon-to-be stepfather's children would soon have a room in our house, which was my sister's previously. It was the summer, and I, a young teenager, often spent my late nights on the couch downstairs, video chatting with friends on my laptop. On one particular night, it was about 2 a.m., and my friends and I had just disconnected out our video call when I heard a peculiar noise at my feet. The sound most closely resembled nails scratching at the pillows near my feet. I was immediately filled with dread, and my legs began to grow colder. My laptop was on my chest, cutting off all view of my lower body, in fear of what, or who I might see if I looked over or around my screen. I called my mother from upstairs. I was facing the stairs, and when she came halfway down the stairs out of bed, I asked her, "What's sitting by my feet?" She angrily replied, obviously, since I had woken her, "Nothing. What's the problem?" I felt better, but not enough to stay downstairs. I went upstairs and climbed into bed for the night. I always sleep with the TV on and my door open, and fell asleep just fine, but was awoken abruptly in the middle of the night. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia was playing. It took me a moment to realize what was happening, but I soon grasped what the gang was doing. They were digging up a grave to steal the jewelry from a corpse or something like that. I was really too young to appreciate the show. And soon after, the characters opened the uncovered coffin, and the camera showed the rotting corpse wearing a white dress. The camera zoomed in on the rotting skull, and my bedroom door slammed shut. And the same scratching sound from earlier grew louder on the pillow right next to my head. I pulled the blankets over my head and forced myself to fall asleep to escape the hell I had found myself in. Some time passed with no further activity. I found myself in the hospital. My sister was giving birth to her first son. I started to tell the story to my aunt, who had lived in the house as a child. She explained that these sorts of things were in no way strange. I was perplexed. She described that when she was younger, a woman would often appear behind her at the top of the stairs. She described that my mother had seen the same woman as a child, but as an adult never admitted it. Actually, whenever I brought it up, my mother only slightly smiled. I believe it was part of her coping process in order to continue living in the house for years to come. Soon after my sister got out of the hospital, I brought up the events to her. She was very calm and described that when she lived in the house, a woman in a white dress would come down from the attic, walk into her room, and stand there silently staring at her. She described the woman would always have long black hair draped over her face. My sister told me she would often ask the woman what she wanted, and after receiving no reply would ask her to go away, which she respectfully did, returning to the attic. After this, perhaps it was just the fear of what I had been told. I always swore that I saw the same woman lingering throughout the house, always from the corner of my eye, drifting into my sister's old room. Late in the summer, There was a night when my family, which was now me, my mum, and my soon-to-be stepdad, were gathered around downstairs in the living room. My mum asked if I could go up and close my sister's old bedroom door, which was located at the end of the short hallway, so that the heat didn't draft into her vacant room, but rather into the 2 occupied bedrooms. When I approached the dark room, I reached my hand normally towards the knob, but as my hand touched the brass handle, things changed. The door flew shut in my face. Immediately, I thought that someone had broken into our home and was in my sister's room. I tried the knob several times, but the door was locked tight. I ran downstairs and explained what happened, and that it was probably wise that we leave the house to call the police. She didn't believe me at first and asked, laughing, that we go upstairs and inspect the door. So I grabbed my little league bat, and 3 of us went to check on the door. Each of us pulled on the knob and were unsuccessful. We heard movement from the room, and my mum and I went outside to wait in the car with the police on speed dial, as my stepdad attempted to get into the room. Eventually, when nothing terrible happened, we went back inside and approached the door once more. My mum, not believing in the ghost stories that had swirled through her home for generations, simply said, "All right, that's enough, just open the door." As she reached for the knob, the door swung open before her hand could touch it. I went inside, checking under the bed, behind the door, and in the closet, but found nothing. My grandfather used to come and visit us quite often before he passed. It was quite easy since he lived in the house he had built next door. Once he had given our house to my mother. He described to me a story that, although I couldn't tell if it was just messing with me or not, he pointed to the large oak tree in the center of our backyard and said that a long time ago a man and a woman lived in the house. The husband had gone insane and killed his wife in the house before going to an oak tree that stood right beside the one in our yard and hung himself. He continued to say that they cut down the oak tree where the deed had been committed, and they left the untainted one standing. What happened next, however, was too real. He took me for a walk behind his house into the woods. A few hundred yards in was a seemingly ancient cemetery. He described that in the cemetery was where the woman was buried, while the man was cremated. In all honesty, I really didn't think about this story too much. A lot of time passed with no significant events taking place. I had only told my best friend Dan of these experiences, and one night I planned to stay over to his house. We were much older at this point, juniors in high school I believe, considering that we were driving, still having an innate fear of the home I lived in, especially being there alone. I asked him to come with me to grab some clothes for the night. He came inside and followed me to the basement where my freshly dried shirts were and started yelling, "Come out, spirits! Come on, come out!" I explained to him, "Dan, the basement looks creepy, but everything bad in the house is upstairs. Please just stop. You get to leave here and not come back. I have to sleep here." He seemed to understand and didn't say anything more as we climbed the stairs, where all of my books and notebooks for the school year were presently stacked. However, when we went into my bedroom, he tried once more to get a glimpse in what I had been describing. As I knelt down to my lowest drawer to get a pair of socks, he began to taunt. As he stopped yelling, we heard a large crash down the stairs. "I told you," I said. When we peered down, we saw that all of the books had been thrown across the room. We didn't say anything to each other. We didn't try to clean up the mess. We just left. Years later, as I write this, the house has been seized by the bank in an equally complicated series of events. I live about 20 minutes from the old house as it sits, rotting. Sometimes I drive there and just sit in the driveway, staring into the upstairs window of my sister's old bedroom, wondering if there's a woman with dark hair staring back. Never once in my life did I go into the attic. The closest I ever came was when one day my sister and her now 2 boys were visiting. Her youngest son and I were upstairs playing with trucks when suddenly he ran into the bathroom. The bathroom was where the steps to the attic were, which my mum had blocked off with several layers of plastic for whatever reason. I was terrified. He had run forwards, what I considered to be into the lion's den. I approached the doorway that went to the stairs, which went to the attic. I peeked in and could barely make out the child in the darkness. He was at the top of the stairs looking at the plastic, taking in his newly forming broken English to someone, something that had called him to the stairway that he didn't know existed. In a rush of courage, I sprinted up the stairs, scooped him up, and shut the door behind me for the last time before we moved out. I used to work at Borders way back when. Though I had another job at the mall, something about being at the bookstore made me much more recognizable. I often had people approach me when I was on the street or ask me about the store's sales. While I was at the drive-thru window, it was mostly harmless stuff, though I got some creeps occasionally. At the time, I had a dating profile set up, but I had to take it down because I'd started getting weird messages from men saying they saw me at the grocery store or something and wanted to touch themselves. Just bizarre stuff. The killing blow that finally made me close it, however, came shortly before my 19th birthday. I was checking my account after work, and I see a message titled, "We've met," which immediately creeped me out. I clicked on it and it said, "Sort of," before proceeding into this very weird graphic description of this guy who was apparently so thrilled by my cashiering skills that it caused a stirring in his loins. This email was seriously like 3 pages long, talking about how excited he was and all of the things he would like to do to my young body. I was horrified to think that one of my customers had been looking at me like that, thinking those things. I clicked on his profile. No photo, but it said he was 56 and single. I needed to know what he looked like, which is the only reason I applied, and I imagine that was his game all along. I didn't respond to any of the other stuff he said, but I asked him if he sent me a picture, and he told me he couldn't put one up because he's sort of a public figure, but he told me he'd email it to me. It took him 2 very long days to get back to me. While I waited, I looked at my message history and discovered that this guy had actually written to me many times. I ignored him because 1, no pictures, and 2, way out of the age group I was looking for. Out of morbid curiosity, I looked at the messages. All of them were filled with graphic things he wanted to do to me. He talked about fantasies of using me with another man he knew, acting out horrific things. Some of the details were specific to me, which led me to believe he wasn't just sending them en masse to every young woman on the site. Meanwhile, this guy is older than my dad. I spent the next 2 days tensing around every older man who came in. I was afraid to be friendly to any of them, for fear that one of them would be this guy and he'd take it as a go-ahead to come at me. I was having a birthday celebration the day he finally got back to me, and the moment I saw his name, I got a bad feeling in my gut. I couldn't immediately place it, but I knew there was something wrong with this person writing these things to me. I stared at it for a moment, positive I knew this guy, but my brain would not let me click. I texted one of my friends to confirm with her as it began to dawn on me. This man was my high school principal. I was horrified. I was still 18 at the time, which means that he must have been creeping on a bunch of us all along. I remember being alone with him in his office, and it makes me feel queasy. Is he just perched and waiting for girls to graduate so he can legally pounce? I wrote back to him and said, "I don't know if you remember me, but you are my high school principal, and I happen to know you're married." He didn't reply, and I thought that was the end of it. I was still super creeped out about that for a while, just thinking about how long he'd been thinking about me and sending me these graphic messages when he'd been an authority figure in my formative years. Almost a year passed without incident, and he didn't come in when I was there. But one day, I started ringing someone up without getting a good look at their face. It was a friendly exchange right until I made eye contact. It was him. He was grinning. I put his stuff in his bag and turned away from the register. He stayed where he was and I pretended to organize some returns, but he kept standing there silently. I knew he was watching me, but I didn't want to look. The moment lasted far too long, so I finally grabbed my headset and asked the manager to come to the front of the store. He hurried out after that, and I never saw him again. It turns out, though, he had recently retired. He no longer worked with children. Regardless, I still contemplated putting the information out there, but I realized there wasn't a whole lot I could do at that point. Technically, he wasn't committing any crimes, just describing kinky fantasies to a legal adult. I thought about it for a long time, discussed it with the people in my life, including a parent who worked with the school, and it just didn't seem worth the risk. It was a smaller area, and I didn't know what might happen to me. Now, I probably would have done something anyway, but I was a kid at the time. As for his wife, I thought about contacting her. My friend's mum knew her, and I had email evidence. However, he only sent his photo through an identifiable account, and I've learnt from a friend's experience prior that it was risky to get involved in marital affairs. I didn't know their situation, and there was a chance his wife may have already suspected his infidelity, but remained in denial because she didn't want her marriage to end. In those situations, sometimes the woman will lash out at her husband's victim because she can't lash out at her husband. My mum and several other older women told me not to get involved too, so I didn't. This might not have been the right move, and even today, I'm not sure if it was. This was over a decade ago, by the way. I still do have the final email somewhere, but I'm not sure I have the ones he sent me on the dating site. They may have just been connected to the account, possibly lost when I deleted it. I think I might have screen capped them, but it was 4 computers ago, so I'm unsure now. I no longer live in the area, and frankly, I feel like it's more likely to invite unwelcome attention onto me than onto him. He could be dead by now, for all I know. This happened to me a few days ago. When it happened, it severely creeped me out. I spoke about it with my therapist, and they suggested I write it out. So my next-door neighbor, who was a nice little old lady, had made cinnamon rolls as a thank you for me shoveling her sidewalk. I was sent out to grab them. She said she kept seeing something in the window, but I saw nothing. I thought nothing of it and moved on. As I was walking up my front stairs, I could see my porch, where we have this light-up Christmas dog. I walk in front of it as normal, but as I am on the side of the porch, I look over, and its head was turned completely on its neck, staring at me. I jumped back in fright and let out a little cry. I shook my head to look at it again. It was normal looking once more, but facing the other way. I grabbed my mum, and she looked from the same angle and saw nothing. Later that night, I investigated the dog and found its head is fixed and can't turn the way I saw it. I don't know what happened, and I don't know if what my neighbor saw was related. God knows I'm terrified of that dog now. I have been fortunate enough in my brief time on this earth to have had many paranormal experiences. I recently noticed activity has spiked at my house as well as my girlfriend's, but the activity at my girlfriend's is much creepier, unfortunately for her. My girlfriend has talked about how she always has these uneasy feelings whenever she's home alone, and about the experiences her older siblings have had and such, like knocking and scratching. Her siblings have long since moved out, and both her parents work and travel, so a lot of the time it's just me and her at the house. At the house, they have a walk-in attic. Basically, it's on the same level as the rest of the second floor, and both upstairs rooms share a wall with it. But the activity doesn't stop there. I first felt something was off, one of the first times I was staying over. No one was at the house except me and her, and we decided to call it a night. She went upstairs before me, and I went into the kitchen for water. I then proceeded to the staircase and felt the sudden urge to sprint upstairs as fast as I could. All throughout the night, we could hear what sounded like heavy furniture being shuffled around downstairs. My girlfriend was understandably in denial, and we eventually fell asleep. We awoke at 9 a.m. the next day, to what was the unmistakable sound of someone running up the stairs. At the time, her bed was against the wall that is shared with the stairs. I actually fell out of the bed from being startled, and we were the only ones at the house that weekend. Let's fast forward to the present. I'm in the house as I'm writing this. The bed shares a wall with the previously mentioned attic. On and off for about an hour, we've been hearing tapping and scratching on the wall behind us. I've already gone into the attic twice with all the lights on and an LED flashlight. I'm no expert, but I couldn't find any evidence of rodents or other pests. Maybe it's something in the wall. I'm a logical person and always try to debunk strange things before confirming them. However, given what we've already experienced, I'm not so sure. We'll just have to wait and see, I suppose. I am a college student, and this happened during my sophomore year. I'm a theatre minor at a college in Wisconsin, and I auditioned for a role in a musical, which I got. The musical was cast right before winter break, and unfortunately, rehearsals start up before our break was over. We needed to come back a week early before everyone else and live on campus to make sure we could attend the nightly rehearsals. The city that my college is in is very small. It's a real college town, so during breaks it almost turns into a ghost town. Almost all the life is sucked out of it when the students go away. Our cast was also small. This was a rather intimate show with only about 8 or 9 cast members, and a lot of them were upperclassmen who had their own houses and apartments. Unfortunately, as the sophomore that I was still living in the dorms at the time. The dorms and educational buildings on my campus are all locked electronically with your student ID acting as a key, and only letting you into certain buildings. As a safety precaution, before breaks, all educational buildings are locked completely and thoroughly checked to make sure no stragglers are left behind. Since I needed a place to live during rehearsals, the university gave me ID access to the dorm I lived in. For reference, the dorm that I was in was big. It was actually 2 full dorm buildings combined into one mega dorm building. And like most buildings on campus, the lights in the hallway/common area are set on motion sensors, so the lights shut off after a set period of time and flick on when they sense motion. They do this to try and conserve energy. Rehearsals during this 1-week period were all night. I believe they started around 6 and we would get out around 11. This was during the winter in Wisconsin, so most nights I would come out of rehearsals and it would be super dark out and snowing heavily. I would make my trek across campus from the theatre to my dorm. Normally this isn't an issue. It's a walk I had taken many times in the past. But remember, I was only of a handful of people on the entire campus, and the only person staying in my dorm building, which normally houses a few hundred students. So the fact that I was pretty much alone in this entire town, and I was the only person in my huge dorm building, was pretty intimidating. I would walk in the pitch black building, only to have the lights flicker on as I entered. The hallways were dead quiet. Rooms were dead quiet. I was the only person there. On top of that, I was the only person with access to the building. As a safety measure, they only gave my ID access to the building I was staying in. The first couple of days were fine. I was obviously a bit creeped out being in this place alone, but I coped and I made it work. On day 4 or 5 into the week, I can't remember which, something unexpected happened. I came back from rehearsals to the massive building and headed straight to my room. I remember sitting down on my couch and starting to watch TV. Some time passed. I'm not sure how much, but then it happened. My door handle jiggled, not a little jiggle, not something that could be explained by a gust of wind or me hearing things. When I say jiggle, I mean the thing rattled like someone was trying to open a locked door. I remember promptly going to my peephole and looking to see if the motion-activated lights had been turned on. My first thought was maybe a security guy came to check on me, or maybe it was a fellow castmate who somehow got into the building and wanted to stop by and say hello. But no, the lights were off. No one caused any movement to turn on the lights. I'm not a drinker and I don't do drugs, so me being under the influence is not an explanation. I have never hallucinated in the past, or had any sort of experience like this before. Someone or something jiggled my door handle. To this day I have no explanation for it, and it has truly frightened me. My family and I moved into a new house, which is a 2x4 house. It used to have an attic but has since been sealed off. After a few months of living in this house, sometimes I'm just watching TV and hear scratching from the roof. I just play it off as being a bird. They're common where we live. And 3 weeks after the scratching, it got worse and more frequent. It's almost as if it were trying to scratch its way out of the roof. The attic entrance is above the outside of my sister's room, and one day my sister tells my dad the seal was open. My dad gets confused because it was supposed to be sealed off, so my dad goes to close it and realizes that it's really hard to open and close, so whatever opened it was strong. That's when I start to get skeptical. The same night I go to get a snack from the fridge. I open it to find out that they're gone. I think my sister must have eaten it. In the morning, my parents are going on about a missing cake. The cake was supposed to be for my niece's birthday. They ask if I had anything to do with it, and I say no, along with all my other siblings. I was getting very suspicious about the attic, so I built up the courage to go check it out. Please note, I am also probably the most paranoid person on this earth, so I was scared for my life, but the curiosity got the best of me. I get the ladder, a torch, and a knife just in case. I open the hatch. I shine my torch inside to see nothing. But as I search, I see the cake, empty snack pellets, dirty clothes, and a short, dark silhouette. It just freezes on the spot, and I immediately bolt and scream for my parents and tell them everything. They tell me to go stay in my room, and when they go and check it out, it was gone. I'm still in shock from that moment and get nightmares from it. We have since moved and no longer live anywhere near there. I moved into this house when I was 10. It sat on a pretty large piece of land in southeast Ohio. About a month or so after moving in, I started to experience my first bout with the paranormal. It wasn't a very large house. The kitchen and living room were connected with one hallway that had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom at the end. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. It seemed like every time I would walk from the living room to the kitchen, I would see a tall, dark man standing at the end of a hallway out of the corner of my eye. He had a cowboy hat, a long trench coat, and long hair down to his shoulders. I'd see him, and my heart would get that sinking feeling, and I would bolt out the back door. I hated it. I told my mum about it all the time, and she said I was being silly, and that I just have an overactive imagination. But it kept happening more and more often. I was really freaked out. It probably didn't help that it was right in front of my bedroom. After about a year or so, I became numb to it. Then it got worse. I started noticing things in my bedroom at night, but I would always be too afraid to get out of bed and check. The corner by the closet door would be really dark for a while, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and then it would go back to normal. Sometimes it would move to parts of the ceiling. I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. One night, I had this terrible nightmare that this stuffed animal that I had won at an amusement park a week or so prior was attacking me, clawing at my throat and trying to choke me. This thing sat on my dresser. When I finally woke up, the stuffed animal was on my chest. I was super freaked out. I screamed and cried all the way to my mum's room. She told me to calm down and that it was nothing, and she laid me back down. A few days later, I was forced awake by something pushing me down on my chest. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I couldn't do anything. After about 10 or 15 seconds, it stopped, and once again I leapt out of bed and ran crying to Mama, and once again she made me lie back down like it was nothing. Everything kind of died down after that. A few months go by, it's winter time, and my mum and I were sitting in the living room watching something on TV. It was about 10 p.m. It was snowing, and I catch my mum staring in the other direction towards the big bay windows. Now I see it too. It was the outline of the tall, dark man standing out the window. I immediately panic. It's him. It's the guy. She grabbed the house phone and dragged me to her room and locked the door. She called the cops, but they said they didn't see anyone, and there was fresh snow on the ground but no footprints. She was freaked out. I think she finally realized I wasn't making any of it up. We moved a month later, and to this day, some 23 years in the future, I still have his image burnt into my mind. This happened about 14 years ago, when I was in my second year of university and living in a student flat. I was 19 at the time, and very into MySpace, and used to chat to friends and friends of friends on there. A few of my friends were models, which is how I stumbled across this guy called Joe. Joe was a professional photographer, with his edgy and provocative photos. With hindsight, I could see he was just a Terry Richardson wannabe, which should have been a giant red flag in itself. But at the time, I thought his style was cool, and he was working something impressive. He was shooting big celebrities and for fashion magazines, so I was really surprised when he replied to my message, complimenting him on his work. We started speaking regularly, and soon he was very keen to come and visit me. He was living in London and I was studying in Winchester, which is just an hour by train, so I didn't think it would be a very big deal. I eventually agreed and met him at the station. From the start, he was very intense. He grabbed my face and started kissing me hard, and as soon as he saw me, I was pretty taken aback. He suggested we go back to my place to watch a film, and I agreed. This was the first of many stupid mistakes. I'm not gonna lie, but I'm also not gonna go into explicit detail. Stuff happened. It was all fine and consensual to start, but it quickly escalated into some rougher stuff and him pushing pretty hard for more. I said no, and he proceeded to give me the whole "I came all this way to see you and you're being like this" guilt speech. I wish I could go back in time and tell my teenage self to kick him out, but I was young and stupid and didn't want to be rude. However, I did stand my ground and we didn't do it, but he also wouldn't leave. He said it was too far to travel back and it was getting late, so we would have to stay over. I had one of the most uncomfortable sleepless nights in my life and was too embarrassed to tell my housemates what was going on. Thankfully, he left first thing in the morning, and I hoped to never speak to him again. He tried messaging a few times and I didn't reply, but this isn't the end of the story. Cut to a few years later, and I see some friends on Facebook posting about Joe. They're sharing horror stories about him. Turns out a few other girls I knew had similar experiences with him, along with the news that he'd been charged with a few counts of sexual assault. Apparently, his success as a photographer gave him just the position of power he needed to force himself on young models under the premise of getting them more work at magazine covers. Several news sites picked up on it, particularly because of his celebrity connections, and he was sentenced to 33 months in prison and banned from working with children and vulnerable adults. I definitely got off lucky and felt extremely guilty for not sharing my experience with my friends earlier. Cut to about 6 years ago, and I was working in social media at a big agency in London. I hated it and was using LinkedIn a lot to try and find a new job when I got a message from a guy I didn't know about some potential freelance work. He said he was starting a new agency which could potentially lead me to more full-time work down the line. He suggested we meet up at a well-known hotel to talk more. This seemed a little odd to me, but I was really keen to leave where I was working. In the middle of planning this, he messages me saying, "You don't recognize me, do you?" His avatar wasn't a close-up photo, so I opened it and took a closer look and froze. It's Joe, but with a different name. Apparently he changed it after he was released. I was so shocked and angry, I couldn't believe he almost lured me to meet him. I told him I had no intention of meeting up with him, and he told me not to believe everything I read. Needless to say, I disconnected him on LinkedIn. I just went through my old LinkedIn messages to find the ones from him and did a search for his name on Google. I don't know if it's the same guy, but the second search result comes up against his name and details of arrests for a violent crime in 2015. His LinkedIn is now disabled and he seems to have disappeared again. Let's hope this time we don't meet once more. When I was about 5 to 7 years old, I lived in a house with my brother and my dad, where we always saw spooky things happening, and we thought it was haunted. One of the things my brother and I remembers from this house was a scary shadow. I was probably 5, and my brother was 2 years older than me. But I know this was not our imagination because we both remembered the same thing. We were walking downstairs while my dad was in the shower, and my brother and I for a split second saw a large shadow behind the bar of a man who looked to be wearing a trench coat and a fedora. It disappeared right after we saw it. Another time our cousin had came over to the house for a sleepover, and he was staying in the hallway upstairs. He was right next to the steps. He was a few years older than my brother and I. He was perhaps 11 or 12 when this happened. But when he was trying to sleep, he heard creaks and ghostly noises. He also claimed to have seen a shadowy figure moving around downstairs. The figure was wearing a trench coat or fedora. In our time at the house, many people have sworn to heard noises from under the porch. My brother and I would never go into the attic alone because we would hear things coming from the ceiling above my brother's room. I haven't been to the house in a long time now, and I'm wondering if we really were haunted by some spirits. My cousin recently reminded me of a memory I suppressed, because it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my childhood. I'm from Texas, so we hardly ever get snow days. So when we did, I tried to take advantage of this. When I was in 6th grade, my school was shut down for 2 snow days. This never happened, and it was a miracle. On one of the days, my cousin came over, and we decided to walk to my old elementary school and go play in the park. It was about 4 blocks away from my house. I lived in that neighborhood for years, so I knew someone on almost every block. I always felt safe, and I knew the neighborhood, so walking to the park with my cousin was no big deal. We got to the park, and surprisingly we were the only 2 people there. We were having a blast. We moved from the playground to the field behind it. To kind of explain the layout, we entered the playground from the back parking lot. So we had to walk through the parking lot or the field next to it to get to the playground. There was a dumpster in the parking lot that was against a brick wall. There was a space between the wall and the dumpster that a lot of teenagers used to hang out behind. On the other side of the wall was the playground, and a few yards to the left of the dumpster was a large field. We're enjoying our time when this truck pulled up. There were 2 men inside, and I got a really bad feeling. I told my cousin that we should probably head home. My cousin insisted it was nothing, so I shook it off and kept playing in the snow. The men got out of the truck and went behind the dumpster. My cousin reassured me it wasn't a big deal, because like I said, a lot of people went back there. That's when they started yelling, saying things like, "Ooh, this is gonna be fun." Even at age 11, I was paranoid. "Come on, let's go home. They're not even talking to us, just ignore them," she said. She was in 7th grade, so I listened to her. That's until we heard the scream. "What are you girls doing here all alone? Where are your parents? You're here all by yourselves?" Chills ran down my spine. I was so scared. My cousin and I looked at each other and automatically started walking really fast through the field to head home. The men came out from behind the dumpster and started yelling, "Where are you girls going? We just wanted to talk to you." We were terrified. Our fast walk turned into a sprint. We got to the sidewalk, and that's when we heard the truck door slam. My heart sank, and I started crying. They peeled out the parking lot. All I could do was think about that we were nearly getting taken. The truck was making its way towards us. Knowing someone on almost every block ended up saving mine and my cousin's life. I had a friend that lived across the street from the school. All we had to do was cut across this small neighborhood intersection and we would be there. The truck caught up to us as soon as we crossed the intersection. They slowed down and the man on the passenger side rolled his window down. "Why are you girls running? We just wanted to have some fun with ye." The truck came to a stop, but we had made it. We ran up to the front door and started yelling for help and ringing the doorbell. The truck then sped off. We were safe. We told my friend and her parents what happened, and my mum came and picked us up. We were so scared, we couldn't even remember any details about the truck or the men. All I know is I would never go to the park alone again. if I didn't think to run to my friend's house, I don't know where I would be. If the men had caught up to us before crossing the intersection, I don't want to imagine what would have happened. I don't know what the two men were planning on doing to us, but I know it wasn't good. So to the two men that ruined my snow day and scared me witless, let's not meet. When I was in my youth, about 13 years old, my friends and I thought it would be a good idea to try and summon a ghost. So we set up a table with candles and such and started our seance. In the beginning, there was nothing, so we decided to leave the table and go out instead. We were at the attic of one of my friend's houses, and the door was not lockable. Weirdly enough, we couldn't open the door, but also all the windows were shut at the time, and the whole room felt charged with electricity. After a few minutes, the door opened by itself, and since then weird things happened to us. I went to my imam instantly and told him about it. He said a prayer for me, and the problem was solved. He also said to me that we invited a lesser demon into our circle, and took my promise to never do such a stupid thing again. Since that day, I started to study occultism theoretically, and witnessed a few exorcisms in which I was really invited by my imam. So I can clearly say that the paranormal exists. I urge everyone to never try summoning anything, because it's not possible to get what you want. You're more likely to summon something far more sinister, which will not rest until it has taken you. I'm from Texas. I don't have many shoes with treading on them. The ones I had gotten were too worn and eventually tore, and I needed to buy some new ones. For context, I'm a chubby 5'4" girl. This was 8 o'clock at night, and this also happened on a very popular and busy street. I live in Chicago for school, and I needed to get some things before the polar vortex. The school I go to is near State Street, and I decided to go to Walgreens that was near the Chicago Theater. I had to stop by Target and then at that Walgreens. As I purchased everything and made sure I had packed in everything, I headed out to the doors. As I walked towards the exit, I noticed a small man was heading in the same direction at the same time, so I let him go first, but he just stood there staring at me. He didn't make any gestures, but I still thought, oh, maybe he wants to be nice and be a gentleman. So I went ahead first and he followed. I noticed that it had started slushing, and I knew I was going to start sliding everywhere because the boots I had on had very thin treading on it. So I had to slow down on my walk or I'd fall on my butt. I started walking, and it was at this point that I noticed him walking at the same pace as me. I thought I was in his way, but I also thought that the sidewalk is extremely big and he could easily walk around me. I still stepped to the side and see if he would go around me or something, but his shadow followed right behind me. I tried walking a little faster, but I could already feel myself slipping and losing balance. He ended up walking a little faster to catch me up, and as soon as he was right next to me matching my walking pace, I asked if he needed anything, but he didn't say a word. When I was in front of the theater, he ended up going in front of me and just stopped me in my tracks. I tried to go to the left of him, but steps in front of me to cut off my path. I tried to go right. He did the same thing. I paced a little faster, and he ended up just circling around me. He ends up blocking my path again, and gets a cigarette, and just gets right up in my face, and tried to light it up, but couldn't because of the slush and wind. I took that chance to slide away from him, but he kept trying to cut in front of me while lighting the cigarette. I made it to the CTA stop to go downstairs, but because he was super tall, he used his massive body to block the stairs in front of me. He was staring me down, and I wasn't sure what to do at that point. To my luck though, an older woman was coming through, and he let her through. I dashed through the small opening he made for her and asked if I could stick with her because of the situation. She was super understanding and said of course. I wanted to tell CTA personnel, but of course there was no one in the booth. We took out our cards at the same time and went through the turnstiles, and he saw that I partnered with her and tried to dash to us, but he either ran out of money or something, because he didn't go through till a few minutes later. My new friend and I started to make small talk to calm me down a little, and asked what train I was going and where my stop was. To my surprise, we were heading to the same destination. He followed us down, still smoking his cig, but that's when CTA noticed him and began approaching him, at which point he turned around so that he could smoke his cigarette fast, so that he would be looking away from us. Our train arrived, we both got on, and he saw us and tried to get on too but missed it by a few seconds. We both saw that it was a close call. We continued chatting even after we got off our stop, and to our surprise, she basically dropped me off home, as she only lives a block further up from me. So to the weirdo who tried following me and stopping me from reaching my destination, you creep, let's not meet again. This happened about 2 years ago. I'm 16 now, and he's going to be 20 in August. We met through the internet. It turned out he lived in a city right next to my village. I was 12, he was 16, and we lost contact. 2 years later, I messaged him again, because my friends edited a photo of him and dared me to send it. He seemed nice. We had a lot of shared interests, and talking with him felt pretty natural. I was used to age differences, because for some reason I never met people my age, so I didn't mind it. He took the bus to my village a few times, and we hit it off pretty well. He even met my best friend. Then I heard he had a Skype call with one of my online friends specifically, that he told her how his last girlfriend supposedly killed herself because of him, because of the horrible things he said to her. My friend felt like he was beginning to crush on her, maybe because she was nice and all too kind. The other friend voiced her worry over him turning her into his ex. She was understandably grossed out. My friends talked with him about it and asked why he told them, but not me. He said I was too immature to understand. I was upset. I was the person who introduced him to my friend group, and he was now trying to forcefully cut me out of it. My friends had enough and cut him out instead. But I didn't. I felt really bad for him. He was an orphan who lived alone, had issues with alcoholism, and a lot of trouble with depression. Losing 3 people could have been very devastating, so I kept messaging him. Maybe out of pity, but he turned very, very creepy very fast. Suddenly, he started calling me darling. I was over the moon because I caught feelings, a little puppy crush on someone I knew I could never date, but who gave me hopes that maybe, just maybe, I could. He spent more time with me, sent me pictures and videos of him going on about his day, nothing too unusual. Until one time, we called while I was busy playing a game on my laptop. I don't remember what I said exactly, but I remember him being very excited that 15 is legal age in Poland. I was excited too. I don't know why. I remember being very stiff, even though this was a harmless phone conversation. The joke was, until February, because I turned 15 then, and he was supposed to visit. I felt like I owed him everything, just because he had issues with his mental health. He told me that his psychiatrist said she had never met someone so young that has lived through so much. Even though our conversations weren't about depression at all, I felt very bad for him. That's why I never said anything about the things he did that creeped me out or made me feel unsafe or uncomfortable, because I was afraid he'd feel worse and do something to himself. A number of times he told me he would end his own life, so what if I were the reason he'd try it again? He'd already told me about his issues with loneliness and abandonment. When he visited, I learned he still had feelings for his supposedly dead ex-girlfriend. He played a song that was their song. Every word in it described their relationship. While we were in my room, he was close to crying, but I had no idea what to do. He put me in this situation even though he knew I wasn't equipped to deal with it. Once, when I was so upset, I told him I didn't want to be cheered up. I just didn't. All I wanted was to be alone. So he sent me a bunch of texts, pictures, and cheap cheer-ups, things he found on his phone. It was the only time I set some sort of boundary, and he broke it immediately, with an "oops, sorry, too late." A little later on in the year, I had a school trip in October, and I had a good time. From what I remember, but for some reason, I lost all of my feelings for him there and then. Perhaps it was because once I didn't force myself to feel bad for him and constantly check if he's online or wanted to talk. And maybe because all my friends thought we were going to date, and it was really unnerving that they didn't see anything wrong with it. I cut contact with him later, very, very slowly. I deleted him off everything. He never checked. I blocked his number, blocked his Facebook, and that's when he noticed, but I never looked back. Later on, through yet another friend, the only one that still kept in contact with him, I learnt that his ex wasn't dead. There were screenshots of him talking with a family member about the funeral, then screenshots of him talking about moving in with a girl 2 years older than he is, who was the love of his life, who had the same name as his ex. He sent a picture that was supposed to prove that she was in a psych ward, but even my friend refused to believe him. I don't even know what he was lying about at the end of it, or if he was lying at all. Next school year, I'm going to go to the city he lives in. I know he's still out there, and I hope to not meet. My family moved into a new house roughly a year and a half ago, which they had to renovate. I moved in with them over the summer. The house itself isn't too bad. They're your typical creepy noises here and there, but nothing like the apartment I grew up in. That was haunted for sure. However, something off about the house is the attic. My brother and his girlfriend live up there, and they themselves have said it feels off. My brother's girlfriend has woken up with scratches on her body, and my brother himself prefers not to be up there too much because of this uneasy feeling. My dad and I were up there the other day to fix my brother's toilet, and we both kept feeling off and uneasy, as if someone were watching us, and I kept catching stuff out of the corner of my eye. This is the only part of the house where we feel this way. I stay in the basement, and I don't even feel that way down there. My family wants me to bless the attic. I'm not a religious person, however I do consider myself spiritual, and I'm also an ordained minister. Does anyone have any tips on how to go about this? Any prayers or objects I should have in my hand when I'm blessing the place? Any assistance would be greatly appreciated. My siblings and I went on a ghost tour in Naperville, Illinois, from 8 to 10 p.m., November 1st, 2019. It is drizzling in around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. There's leftover snow on the ground from the 3 inches we got the day before. This was my first tour where EMF detectors got provided for us. The detectors were the Ghost Meter brand, and these detectors beep and flash, and I had my detector on full volume the whole time. We got some beeps and blips throughout the tour, but nothing interesting, until we arrived at the exact spot of the 1964 Naperville train disaster. The disaster left 45 dead, when an 85-mile-an-hour train rear-ended a stationary one. We were walking up the street where the public lined up the corpses and put body parts like puzzles together. All at once, everyone's detectors started to go off when we are halfway down the block. Our guide comes up to me and the conversation is as follows. "If someone is here, can you make this beep slower?" My detector's beep slowed down. I say, "Can you make it stop?" It stops. Everyone's detectors were still going but mine. The detector still read a 2. The guide asks, "Were you a World War II soldier?" The beep starts up again. Then I ask, "Would you be surprised to know the year is 2019? The beeping abruptly stops. Then I ask, "Were you on the train?" The beeping starts again. "We're sorry you died." The guide then says, "You can go now. Head to the light." And all the detectors stop and the readings go down to 0. We all sat there in shock for a good 15 seconds. We might have just helped a spirit move on. I've always been interested in the paranormal, but never have been a full believer in ghosts. Being there and having this happen to me on my EMF has definitely made me think differently now.